Welcome back, listeners, to another deep dive episode of Daily Gossip. I am your host, and today we are stepping away from the usual celebrity chatter and corporate scandals because, frankly, the biggest, most consequential gossip in the world right now is happening on the geopolitical stage. If you are tuning in from London, New York, Berlin, or Toronto, grab your coffee, maybe even something a little stronger, because what we are unpacking today directly impacts your wallet, your security, and the global order we have all grown up taking for granted. Today, we are dissecting the fascinating, somewhat unsettling, and undeniably historic rhetoric coming out of the recent summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Beijing. We have managed to get our hands on the core transcripts of the address, and let me tell you, reading between the lines of this diplomatic speak is like reading a manifesto for a completely new world order. So, sit back, plug in your earphones, and let's get into the geopolitical gossip of the century. Picture the scene. The grandeur of the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. The meticulously choreographed handshakes. The red carpets that seem to stretch into infinity. This was not just a routine diplomatic visit. This was the 25th time Vladimir Putin has visited China. Think about that number for a second. 25 times. In the world of high-stakes diplomacy, where every flight, every minute of a head of state schedule is scrutinized and negotiated for months, 25 visits is not just a partnership. It is a profound, strategic bromance that is designed to send a very clear, very loud message to Washington, Brussels, and everywhere in between. As President Xi stood before the press, welcoming his, in quote, Honorable President Vladimir Putin, in quote, and, in quote, distinguished Russian colleagues, end quote, the air was thick with the weight of history. He noted that this year marks the 30th anniversary of China's strategic partnership with Russia. For those of us in our 30s and 40s, 30 years ago was the early 90s. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. The West was riding the high of the, end quote, end of history, end quote, assuming liberal democracy and free market capitalism had permanently won the day. Fast forward to the present, and she is standing there, declaring that over these past 3 decades, China-Russia relations have, end quote, weathered storms and advanced with the times, end quote, reaching the absolute highest level in their shared history. Let us unpack the sheer scale of what they are announcing. They have just signed a joint statement on further strengthening what they call their, end quote, comprehensive strategic coordination, end quote. Now, in diplomatic circles, end quote, strategic coordination, end quote, is the polite suit and tie way of saying, end quote, we are aligning our massive militaries, our massive economies, and our massive global influence to push back against the current boss, end quote. And who is the current boss? The Western-led international order. Furthermore, they are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the China-Russia Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. She made a point to emphasize the principles of this treaty: non-alignment, non-confrontation, and not targeting any third party. Now, let us pause and have a real talk here. If you are sitting in Europe watching a grinding war on your eastern flank, or if you are in the United States watching tensions simmer in the South China Sea, the phrase, end quote, not targeting any third party, end quote, sounds a bit like a dark comedy. It is the ultimate geopolitical humble brag. They are explicitly telling the world that they do not need a formal NATO-style military alliance because what they have is actually far more flexible and far more dangerous to the status quo. They claim to be committed to mutual respect, equality, and win-win cooperation, but the subtext is glaringly obvious. This is a united front against what they perceive as Western hegemony. To understand where this relationship is heading, President Xi laid out a highly structured, 4-point master plan for what he calls, end quote, higher quality development, end quote, of their ties. It is a roadmap for the future, and we need to pay very close attention to each of these pillars. The first point is all about political mutual trust and mutual strategic support. She stated flat out that political trust is the defining feature of Sino-Russian ties. He and Putin have reached a mutual decision to extend the duration of their good neighborliness treaty. But here is the kicker, the part that should make Western policymakers sit up straight. She called on both sides to firmly support each other on issues involving their, end quote, core interests and major concerns, end quote. What exactly are these, end quote, core interests, end quote? In the language of Beijing and Moscow, this is a very specific code. For China, the ultimate core interest is Taiwan, along with its territorial claims in the South China Sea and its absolute domestic control. For Russia, its core interests revolve around its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, primarily Ukraine, and pushing NATO back from its borders. By publicly pledging to support each other in OPPO's core interests, China is effectively saying they will implicitly back Russia and OPPO's play in Europe, and in return, Russia will back China and OPPO's play in Asia. They are committing to maintaining close strategic communication at all levels. This means their generals are talking, their intelligence agencies are sharing notes, and their diplomats are coordinating their voting blocs at the United Nations. It is a profound consolidation of power. Moving on to the second point, and this is where the rubber really meets the road for us regular folks who care about the global economy. Empowering mutually beneficial cooperation to advance their respective development and revitalization. Let us talk numbers. She proudly announced that bilateral trade volume has topped $200 billion for 3 consecutive years. Even more staggering, despite what he called the, in quote, complex external environment, end quote, which is Beijing and OPPO's polite euphemism for crushing Western sanctions on Russia, bilateral trade grew by nearly 20% in the first 4 months of this year alone. Think about the magnitude of that growth. While the United States and the European Union have been working overtime to financially isolate Russia, to freeze its central bank assets, and to cut it off from the SWIFT banking system, China has stepped in as the ultimate economic lifeline. This is no small feat, as Xi himself noted. They are not just trading goods. They are building an entirely parallel economic ecosystem that is largely immune to Western financial weapons. And they are not stopping at oil and gas. While energy and resources remain the, end quote, ballast, end quote, of their cooperation, she made it clear that they are accelerating into the future. They are deepening the alignment of China and OPPO's massive, state-directed 15th five-year plan with Russia and OPPO's development strategy through the year 2030. They are cultivating new drivers in the digital economy, artificial intelligence, and technological innovation. This is a crucial pivot. For years, the West assumed that authoritarian regimes could not innovate, that true technological advancement required free speech and liberal markets. China and Russia are actively trying to prove that theory wrong. By combining Russia and OPPO's scientific pedigree with China and OPPO's unparalleled manufacturing scale and data resources, they are attempting to build an AI and tech bloc that rivals Silicon Valley, completely independent of Western supply chains. Now, let us transition to the third pillar of this strategy, which focuses on something slightly softer but equally insidious: people-to-people connectivity. She spoke at length about deepening the bond of their enduring friendship through education, culture, tourism, and sports. He highlighted that youth support for the China-Russia friendship has grown stronger. At first glance, this might sound like standard diplomatic fluff. Cultural exchange programs, university partnerships, student swaps, it all sounds very innocent. But in the context of authoritarian statecraft, this is about ideological alignment. When she talks about boosting collaboration between universities and research hubs to achieve, end quote, tangible results in talent cultivation, end quote, he is talking about creating a generation of elites in both countries who view the West not as an aspirational model, but as a declining, hostile force. They are actively trying to engineer a shared worldview among their younger generations. It is a long game. By weaving their societies closer together, they make it much harder for future leaders in either Moscow or Beijing to ever break this alliance. They are insulating their partnership from domestic political shifts by making anti-Western sentiment and Sino-Russian solidarity a core part of their national identity. This brings us to the fourth, and arguably the most alarming, point of President Xi's address: global cooperation and the reform of global governance. This is where the mask fully comes off, and the grand strategy is laid bare for the world to see. She painted a grim picture of the current international landscape. He stated that the world we live in today is, end quote, quite turbulent, end quote, and he laid the blame squarely at the feet of, end quote, unilateralism and hegemonism, end quote, which cause, end quote, grave harm, end quote. He warned that the world faces the danger of regressing to the, end quote, law of the jungle, end quote. If you are a millennial or older living in a Western democracy, you need to understand exactly what he is saying here. End quote. Unilateralism and hegemonism, end quote, are not abstract concepts in this speech. They are direct, unfiltered attacks on the United States and its alliance network. China and Russia are framing themselves as the responsible adults in the room, the ones trying to save the world from American overreach. Xi highlighted his proposal for a, and quote, shared future for all of mankind, and quote, and his 4 global initiatives, claiming they have received widespread support from the international community. And here is where they leverage their ultimate institutional power, the United Nations. She reminded the audience that as permanent members of the UN Security Council, China and Russia must firmly fulfill their responsibilities as major powers. They claim to uphold the authority of the UN and international fairness and justice, while opposing all forms of unilateral bullying. It is a fascinating rhetorical flip. The countries frequently accused of violating international law, whether through the invasion of sovereign neighbors or the militarization of international waters, are positioning themselves as the true defenders of the UN Charter. They are systematically working to block Western initiatives at the UN, effectively paralyzing the Security Council, and then using that paralysis as proof that the Western-led system is broken and needs to be replaced. Perhaps the most culturally specific and emotionally charged part of this global governance argument was Xi's reference to history. He stated, and quote, in particular, we must oppose all provocative acts that deny the outcomes of the victory in World War II or seek to rehabilitate and revive fascism and militarism. End quote. To an American or European listener, this might sound completely out of left field. Who is trying to revive fascism? But you have to view this through the lens of Russian and Chinese domestic propaganda. For Putin, framing the conflict in Ukraine as a continuation of the, end quote, Great Patriotic War, end quote, against fascism is central to his justification for the invasion. By explicitly adopting this language, Xi Jinping is validating Putin's narrative on the global stage. It is a profound weaponization of history. They are telling the global south, the countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, that the West is on the wrong side of history, that the West represents the true imperialist, even fascist threat, and that Moscow and Beijing are the vanguard of a, end quote, just and reasonable global governance system. End quote. As we analyze the closing remarks of this monumental address, the tone shifts from defensive to triumphalist. She declared that, end quote, prosperity lies in keeping up with the times, end quote, and that the great cause of China-Russia friendship aligns with, end quote, the historical trend and the tide of the times, end quote. He concluded that it is bound to move steadily, reach far, and forge ahead to write new brilliant chapters. This is not the language of 2 countries that feel isolated or cornered. This is the language of 2 superpowers who believe they are winning. They look at the political polarization in the United States, the economic stagnation in parts of Europe, and the exhaustion of Western electorates with overseas conflicts, and they see an opportunity. They believe the, end quote, tide of the times, end quote, is washing away the liberal democratic order, and they are building the ark that will float above it. So what does this mean for us? For the 30-somethings trying to buy a house, the 40-somethings worried about their kids and oppos, futures, the people listening to this podcast on their commute, it means the world is fracturing into competing blocks faster than anyone anticipated. It means supply chains are going to get more complicated. Inflation might become a structural feature rather than a temporary bug as global trade fragments, and the threat of large-scale geopolitical conflict is higher than it has been since the height of the Cold War. The decisions being made in the Great Hall of the People are going to ripple outward, affecting everything from the price of the microchips in your car to the cost of the fuel that heats your home. We can no longer afford to view foreign policy as something that happens, end quote, over there, end quote. The partnership between Xi and Putin is a direct challenge to the economic and security architecture that has underpinned Western prosperity for nearly 80 years. They are telling us exactly what they plan to do. The only question now is whether the rest of the world is actually listening. That is all for today's deep dive, folks. We have covered a lot of heavy ground, from billion-dollar trade deals to the weaponization of history. I want to thank you for sticking with me through this complex but absolutely crucial topic. Understanding these shifts is the first step to navigating them. If you found this analysis insightful, if you want to stay ahead of the curve on the real stories shaping our world, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Leaving a rating and a review goes a massive way in supporting the Daily Gossip channel and helps us bring more of this unfiltered, behind-the-scenes news straight to your feed. Share this episode with a friend who needs a wake-up call about the state of the world. And until next time, keep your eyes open and stay curious. Thanks for listening.